Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Coach's Journey podcast. And no pre-recorded intro today. We're going to go straight in for this episode for reasons that will become clear. Before we get into that, I want to do my normal thank yous to members of the Coach's Journey community and supporters of the podcast. That's a way to support the show, keep it going, enable it to go to new places, which again, we'll get to in the next little while. And thanks to everyone who supported the show, shared it with other people. Had a lovely little exchange on LinkedIn the other day about the Toku McCree episode recently. And people saying that as they read the post that someone had shared about the show, Alex Swallow, who again we'll get to shortly, they were also already listening to the episode, the interview with Toku. So it's lovely to feel the show reaching out. So thanks to everyone who shared it, and thanks in particular to Kusum Ravindranath, David Norris, and then particularly to Alex Whitton, Joey Owen, Ruth Saville, Neil Mackinnon, and Alex Swallow. Again, because we'll get to that in a minute. So let's do some headlines of what we're going to do today in this call, of what you're going to listen to. We've got some exciting changes coming for the Coach's Journey podcast. In a way, this is the start of Coach's Journey 2.0. It's almost exactly 4 years since the podcast started. I'm pretty sure the first episode was November 2019. You're listening in probably, if you're listening as it comes out in December 2023. 4 years has flown by, 50-something episodes, and it's time for something to just shift so that we can move this on to a new level, hopefully have it reach new people and be even better. And the two big changes are from 2024, the podcast is going to go back to being fortnightly. What do you mean back? Most people are saying. Well, for the first few months of this show, before I realized it was way too much for me to do alone, it was going to be a fortnightly podcast. And then I got stressed out because I couldn't keep up with the content, and because I was doing all of it myself, then it was taking over my life. And I moved to monthly, and that's one of the kind of classic habit building moves in my view, that I kind of, as I really got into the 12-minute method work in the last few years, really became clear to me that much better to have a habit that you can continue with for the long term, that is sustainable, than something that you run out of energy for because you've tried to be the hare, not favored the tortoise. But we're going to go back to fortnightly. And part of the reason that is going to be possible is going to be joined by 5 new hosts over the next year. So they are the people that I've been kind of unsubtly hinting about so far in this show. They're joining me on this call. So unmute yourselves, I think, and say hello if you're on mute when I introduce you. So I'm very delighted to be joined by Joey Owen.
Hello there.
Neil Mackinnon.
Hello.
Alex Whitton.
Hi, everyone.
Alex Swallow.
Everyone.
And Ruth Saville.
Hello.
And it's great because I nearly did a blind date reference to introduce you and ask you to do what's your name and where do you come from. And I didn't do that because I thought that'd be a bit too much, because I'd have to say your name. It's the problem with Zoom introductions. You have to say, Joey, tell me your name. And then it's all done, isn't it? But I did get to still feel like a game show host then, which is very important for the rest of the show. So fortnightly and a new team of hosts, which will enable that fortnightly thing without me getting worn out. And I think more importantly than that will bring more of the energy that will enable the Coach's Journey podcast to become something more than it has been so far. One of the reflections I haven't shared with any of you, actually, I had it this morning. So I'm doing some work at the moment with Robert Holden, who, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, remains for me one of the, I don't know what I'd call it. Well, maybe I'd call it the most interesting people operating in the coaching space in the UK. And the way he holds things, so many things about that. And his latest book is called Higher Purpose, which I haven't read. Luckily, I don't think Robert will be listening to this show, so he doesn't know that. But he's also started a new membership called Purpose Club, which is actually a really affordable way to work with him, which everyone should check out. And I joined that, and it's had me thinking about purpose. His big question in a way in that work seems to be, when are you on purpose? And what do you know about that? And I think I really I just got that this morning or last night. One of the things that the changes that we've been talking as a team now, the Coach's Journey team, the 6 of us, plus the people that work on the show, but the 6 of us have been talking about this for a couple of months now. We first had email discussions over the summer, and we've had various meetings to kind of get this moving, and we'll talk about where we're up to with all that over the course of the show. Since we started doing that, I feel like I'm on purpose with the coach's journey again. And that was not true. And this is like probably the number one most important reason that something had to change with the show, was that it wasn't feeling how it felt when it first started, which I think was, and this is really useful reflection for me, because I find that question that Robert's asking, when are you on purpose, actually really hard to answer. It's why I need to be part of Purpose Club and why I need to be continually asking that question. He's really good at inviting us to have a living question to sit with. And I don't know what purpose means. I don't know what being on it means for me. So, but this is a great insight, right? The Coach's Journey podcast was on purpose for me. Absolutely, it was the edge of my comfort zone or beyond it. It was full of new things. It was really creative until all those three things, which I think are actually part of, that's kind of the answers I have already about when am I on purpose, until they all stopped being as true. And that's when I first started thinking about this. So what I'm going to do now, everybody, is I'm going to tell a little bit of the story of how this change came about from my point of view. Your new friends, Joey, Neil, Alex, and Ruth, are going to jump in. Maybe if they have questions or reflections on that, you'll get to know them in ways that we'll explain shortly over the next year in a great way, which I'm really excited about. And so the reason this happens, actually, one more thing. I was slowing down. I've been thinking about over this last year or so about, what do I do? What's the zone of genius? What are the things that I do? I've been trying to come back to that as I think about the next phase of my work, and I keep coming back to one of those. In fact, the first. When I always tell this story, the what would you call it? Like the first shoot of the Coach's Journey was someone canceling on me in about 2017, and me having made a decision from my coaching to, when people canceled on me, instead of just getting pissed off and upset and feeling like it was a judgment on me, I would do something cool. So I wouldn't go to my emails. It would be a treat. I would treat myself to action that was cool. And what I did when this very delightful client canceled on me, to stop myself getting upset, was I wrote an article about how I'd gone full-time in coaching. And that article, which will probably release as a podcast episode next year, I might come back to that later in the show, why that is, still is my most read article, and it about how I became a full-time coach. And I gave it a clickbaity title, less than 2 years after starting my training, and that sparked this whole thing. And I often think back to that as in Gay Hendricks' zone of genius questions. One of the questions is, what in your work creates the highest ratio of satisfaction and abundance to time spent? I'm just going to give that again. What in your work creates the highest ratio of satisfaction and abundance to time spent? If you can get answers to that question, and then you just do those things as much as possible, that's life in some ways. And that article was one of the things that really came up for me. It's like, wow, that was like 2 hours. By the time I was asking those questions, it had already created 2 or 3 clients, so thousands of pounds, all these conversations that had come out of it, loads of followers on LinkedIn and in other places. So it was a real move like that. And so one of the games is try and repeat that. And so the reason that I'm going to tell the story of how this shift came about today, and I want that to be part of this conversation, is to try and do that thing again, because there's something about describing the process of how things have happened that sometimes for people, when I do that, I think when anyone does it, but when I do that, sparks things for people. So that was a long setup. By the way, I was just saying to the team before we switched on, I'm so glad they're here today, because the most exhausting, not by no means the worst, and in lots of ways, some of my favorite episodes of the show have been the ones that I've done by myself. Trying to create, accidentally in some of them, a 90-minute, 2-hour podcast show by yourself, just like so tiring. So even just having nice faces on a Zoom call to look at while I'm talking is a real relief. But yeah, so, okay, let me slow it down. So I started to feel off purpose, is I think how I would talk about it now, last year in 2022 about the show. And like the most clear, the time I really remember that, I was talking to Steve, another part of the team who writes almost all the copy for the show now. Like, is it okay for me to just repost other podcasts I've been on for a couple of months? And he was like, yeah, because you need a rest, and you can tell the audience that. And I'm pretty sure I did in those intros for a couple of episodes in summer 2022. So stuff was up then. And the things that were up were a mixture of things. Like I was definitely starting to have less energy around the interviews. That was one of the things. I would find myself not in the interviews. This is a really interesting distinction. And one of the things that kept me in this loop for a while was when doing the interviews, I would feel amazing. Like by the end of it, it would feel beautiful. I would be like so grateful to have done it. I would feel like I'd been again in the zone of genius, in those wonderful feelings that you can have when you're in presence and connection with somebody for a long time. But in the build-up, I would kind of resent that they were there. They're long. It was like a lot of time when I could have been on other things. So there's a signal here, right? We don't have to trust that signal. We don't have to look forward to everything. But I know what resistance feels for me, and it didn't feel like resistance. It felt like genuinely there's something off here. And then what I do, and I talked about this when I talked about creating the Coach's Journey community in that podcast episode, which just feels like a long time ago now. It's like episode number 18 or something like that. Whereas it feels to me that the community is new in the life of the Coach's Journey. It's really not. I talked about that a bit in that. What I find when I'm creating a new idea in my business is often what happens is I sit with a problem and I try and solve it. And I come up with a bunch of solutions and none of them solve it. And then I find a new solution which solves not just that problem, but a bunch of other secondary problems that I've had in mind all at once. So for example, with this show, the first obvious thing I could do would be just stop doing the show. Like that's okay. And I did think about that quite a bit. And then I thought about the coaching industry and I thought about the other coaching podcasts. And at one point I think when I spoke to Phil Goddard, right, who has one of the other, probably the longest, certainly the longest UK-based coaching podcast that I know of. Certainly the one that's most similar to this, a bit different. I don't know, like the Barefoot or Animus ones might have been longer, but they're a little different because they're, based out of a coaching school and probably created by those coaching schools essentially as a marketing thing, as well as other things. Whereas Phil's podcast, like this one, felt like a creative piece of work as well as a piece of service for the coaching industry. I remember talking to Phil about that, and I made a joke that I think he didn't really laugh at, and it was the first thing we'd done on the show together. And I wondered if it was going to be a slightly hellish conversation about the fact that during the pandemic, like everyone was taking over mine and Phil's podcasting space. I think it was the fact that I might have referenced the fact that we were both men with very little hair, that he didn't. Maybe it was too soon in our relationship for me to do that. But so there were loads of podcasts created over the pandemic. We went from having almost no podcasts about coaching to like millions. And there are some great looking ones. I have to say I don't listen to many. But like the Association for Coaching has some great podcasting. People should check that out. I know Mackinnon, who does work on that pretty well. And I did an episode last year with a guy called Rob Lawrence on marketing coaching in a series they did. They do some good stuff. Actually, Coaches Rising may have been around longer than Phil's show as well. I guess that's another long-standing one that I'm aware of. There are more in the US. But when I slowed down thinking about should the show stop, it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like, I think if somebody else had been doing exactly this and had been doing it better, I would have stopped then. But there isn't anybody doing this, or the people that aren't doing it better, was my take. And since having that take, well, actually that's not true. Since we started doing this, since we started moving to Coach's Journey 2.0, that has felt stronger and stronger. That's the case, that this is a better move. The other problems though I had is like, if I'm going to do something, I want to do it well. And from having done quite a lot of learning about podcasting, pretty obvious to me is that the way to grow a podcast is the number one easiest way to grow a podcast is to make it more regular. And I knew that I couldn't do that because of all the reasons I mentioned at the start of the show. And so I had another idea. I could give the show, another thing I had was like, if I'm not going to stop it and I can't make it more regular, I could give it to somebody. And that didn't feel right either. Like I thought about the people it could be over the last, probably longer than that, actually, like maybe over the last 2 years, I've thought about some people and thought, I could give it to her. I could give it to him. And again, it didn't really feel right to me. Like there was something missing from that solution. And I guess what I'm doing is I'm listening to what people might call, different people call it this, a full body yes. I'm listening for like, what is the actual way forward, the strong intuition here. Other things, other problems, the secondary problems that I was noticing, like I have loads of ideas for the Coach's Journey, things I could do, things I could make, and they never get done because I don't have any more time to, with integrity, give to this part of my business. whilst doing what I've been doing on the show. Like I have the time for that, and more doesn't feel right. And then the last thing was that the last part of this puzzle is the podcast does enable the Coach's Journey community. And probably what we'll do in a little while in this show, we'll see where we get in this episode, we'll see where we get to, is talk a bit about the evolution of the Coach's Journey. But one of the things was, one of the reasons the podcast started wasn't pure marketing. You know, I kind of believe we made this distinction on a community call before. I believe if you're going to do something, even if you're doing it for a goal, that it has to become soul work. So the podcast was soul work for me. It was purpose work. I did know, though, that if I did this, it could be the marketing for the work I do with coaches. And the community has become really, really important to me, and parts of my work that I really do look forward to, that do hold that on purpose feel in all that way. And I guess the last part of this, what I didn't say is, a big part of why it's important to me that the show doesn't stop is because I really believe that the world needs more coaches doing thriving work. And to do thriving work, they have to have businesses that work. And to have businesses that work, they have to know how other people make it work. And the market just isn't served enough authentically, with integrity in that space. We all know, any coach who's listening knows that it is served is overserved in that space, but not by useful, honest, true, ways to actually make this thing work. And it's probably worth saying, again, because I've said this before, but probably not on the show or not for a while. When I talk about my work these days, I talk about the three parts of it: the creativity part, that's about the 12-minute method; the leadership part, that probably is going to be my focus for what I'm creating in next year, and that's partly enabled by this. And partly it's about coaching. And the reason that it's still about coaching after all this time, after lots of second guessing, as you can hear, is like, is coaching the right place for me to be doing this work? Is that just a bit pyramid schemey? Like, what is going on? Why do I do this? It's because every time I slow down to think about how do we actually make the world a better place, I know that coaching is a part of that. And we need essentially an army of coaches, but not mechanized coaches. I've just recorded the last episode of the show before this one is an interview with Claire Pedrick and Lucia Baldali. Their new book is The Human Behind the Coach. And, there's some nice bits in it that it feels like they, with integrity, can say that thing that you hear lots of people saying, which is, some bits of coaching can be done by AI. So let's do the bits that can't, right? Which is about the humanity. And we need coaches that can do that. And that's a part of what this show helps people do, or at least that's the intention behind it. And this team has had some really lovely conversations about what makes the show, which has really emphasized that to me. So I had all these problems to solve, and I was sitting with them. And then what's happened since I've become a dad, where a bunch of my time is spent in a dark room with a small girl trying to get her to sleep. That's where I have my ideas. So that's where my subconscious kicks in, like a lot of the time. So it's the new showering or running for me, right? It's like set your mind on the problem. I talked about this in a 12-minute blog post recently. It's from Adam Grant wrote about it in Originals. I can't remember if it's his work or somebody else's. A really powerful technique is to set your mind on a problem, do some of the work on it, and then stop and let the subconscious for days or weeks do its work, because it will come up with the ideas and then they'll come back. I think this is why maybe Adam Grant says this in Originals, I can't remember, or maybe it was a clever idea I had. Then they come back when you're having a shower, when you're out for running, when I'm trying to get Leah to sleep. One day when I was trying to get Leah to sleep, I just thought, oh yeah, giving it to one person is not right. Stopping it is not right. But what about inviting some people to join me in hosting the show? And then I was able to sit with that and see how it would solve all those problems, how it would release the pressure. I didn't know that it would. I didn't know it would shift my energy so much, but I knew it would practically release the pressure. It would enable us to go fortnightly without me having to work like a day a week or 2 days a week on the Coach's Journey, which it just doesn't. It feels off purpose to me. And it would also solve a couple of other problems, actually, that I haven't mentioned. So I'd had a few bits of feedback, completely accurate feedback, which is that the podcast's become slightly different in the last year. or 2 years. And that's because I'm interested in different things now. So it's much less, in the nicest possible way, it's much less interesting for me to sit down and ask somebody about the detail of their journey and how they built their business than it used to be, because I've done it a lot. And what I get interested in now is, my favorite episodes of the last couple of years, I haven't looked at the thing, but it's probably Jennifer Garvey Berger, because I got to get into these amazing ideas with this woman that I think is just an absolute genius. And that is one of my most exciting episodes of the last couple of years. And yet it was really different. It's more like I've often said this is the Tim Ferriss show, but for coaches. But it is more like a modern Tim Ferriss show episode where he's like just talking to somebody about an idea that he likes, than it is like an original Tim Ferriss show episode, which is where the journey and the digging in is really important. Alex, Swallow.
Just wanted to ask Robbie, I'm really curious about intuition. And I just think for the audience, like, did you, once you came to that realization, was it as you were looking after Leah and trying to get her to sleep, was it a flash of inspiration and you were sure that that was the right thing? You had an embodied sense that was right? Or was it something that you kind of thought, oh, that's an idea, and it was when you prodded and poked at it a bit with your mind that you then determined that was the interesting way to go? I would just love to know.
It's such a great question, and I'm laughing because it involves my psychology showing up in like its classic way. So it was inspiration. On the most level, I knew it solved all the problems. It was the way forward. But the way I work, the way I have to wrestle with myself, means that it was then, I don't know. I mean, not a long time, but months before I emailed you all, which is what moved this. So but that's how I mostly am, right? Like, and it's good to still say that, because it doesn't always look that from the outside. You don't know what's going on, but no, like an area of growth for me would be to trust those moments more and move faster on them. I don't think I needed to move faster on this one. Like, I kind of hinted at this on episodes of the show before, and you five know a lot of the detail of this, but it's been a kind of really, really weird year for me, and personally. And so with some death and the birth and all these kind of things. And so it was like rushing it wasn't the right thing, and the timing of it was perfect and all that kind of thing. But it's a great question. So just to catch that thing I was just saying, the other thing that had been happening was that the feedback, the feedback was it's becoming a different show. And whilst me interviewing Jennifer is, I think, a very, very cool episode for anybody who wants to listen to it, it's not quite the same thing as the real what makes the show the show. And having other people in with new perspectives at different stages in their coaching journeys, in whatever way that is, that feels to me like it solves that problem. It gets the show back to what makes the show, and we get to we get to really live into what is this thing, not what is my podcast, right? Which is essentially a different thing. It's interesting, actually. So I was listening back to my first interview with Claire Pedrick the other day, where she tells a story of why her company is called 3D Coaching. And it was her dad basically gave her this, he said this, I think he said, don't call it, she was going to call it Claire Pedrick Coaching. So actually, I had this insight on the way on today. So let's share this, because I think this is good for coaches. This is what you should call your company, right? Everybody, you should call it your name, right? Your website should just be, this is for all coaches, it should just be your name, right? Unless you have a common name, in which case it should be your name and then coaching. So that if people Google Robbie Swale, they're just going to find me, right? There's no other Robbie Swales. My wife used to be called Emma Smith. She should have, if she had a coaching business before she got married, she should have called it Emma Smith Coaching. She gets an absurd number of emails on her Gmail for other Emma Smiths. Has to like email them back saying, please don't take away this person's home because of their student loan repayments. You've been emailing someone in England, not Canada, that kind of thing all the time. So if your name is common, you should call your business that name and then coaching, and that should be your website. And only if you think one day, like Claire, that you might want your business to live on without you, should you give it a name that is not your name. And I didn't know that when I started this, but it's obvious to me that that is why it's good that this is called The Coach's Journey. Because if it was called the Robbie Swale podcast, well, some of these problems wouldn't have existed, because I could have happily gone off on a massive adult development tangent with Jennifer without it mattering in the show. And that's why it's good that Ferriss called it the Tim Ferriss Show, and lots of people call their podcast after them. But this isn't that. And we want this thing to live on and go to somewhere new. And by having you all on board, that helps, right? Because you will all bring your own energy to those conversations in your own way. It relies much less on my filter of the reality of coaching, because we've got 5 other perspectives on that. It will spread the net of who knows about the show, but also who comes on a show, which is really important, because, for me to for all the reasons we've just been talking about, for me to make this sustainable, I have to be following my interest, right? I have to be speaking to the people that I'm most interested to speak to. But that does involve my filter of reality and coaching. And it'll be a show much more fit for the complexity and diversity of the coaching industry by having the 5 of you here. And so I think that is, let me just check my notes of sort. I think that is basically how we got here. And then I'm going to say a tiny bit about what's going to happen next for everybody. And then and then we'll see where we get to. So what happens next is maybe it's worth saying a little bit about why you 5 ended up here. So it's interesting, actually, because I slowed down with then, who do I know? Like, who would my 10 out of 10 people for this be? And that was when I had this insight about the Coach's Journey community, which in some ways now, accidentally, and we might get to in the show, we'll see how interesting it is to do that, this episode, the story of how it came about. But in some ways now, that is for me the best bit of the Coach's Journey. And I didn't know that because it was partly designed, as if you listen back to episode 18, where I talk about it, it was partly designed because we were having Leah at the time when I normally launched a group coaching program, and I couldn't do it. And so now is the time to solve a bunch of problems and create something new. But I love that. I love how it's structured. I love the calls. I love the people that come and go. And in a way, what I didn't realize until we were doing this, so this is part of the inspiration, this came after, this is some of that, to get to your question again, Alex, I realized that this would enable me to bring some of what's special about the Coach's Journey community into the podcast. So what I sat down and thought about basically was, who are the people that I trust with this baby that I have created? Who are the people that really understand me? Either by, in fact, in all your cases, by being members of the community, by working with me and knowing me in some different ways, in some cases, and know what's special about the community, having been at different times and in different ways long-term members, and who knows the show. Who do I know who has really listened to the show and appreciated it, who it's been part of their journey, and who do I think would be great? And then what was interesting is my resistance. So during this time between the insight and emailing you all, my resistance, of course, showed up. And I was doing a workshop with a colleague of mine called Amaya Pellegrin, amazing woman. I'm very grateful. So Amaya she doesn't really know this, although I'll tell her I'm seeing her next month. She had an important part to play in this. So she was running an idea development session for some of the most exciting researchers at the University of Edinburgh. And it was a framework. And whenever I'm facilitating something, I try and do the exercises I'm asking of people ahead of time. And whenever I'm not facilitating something, but I'm in the room, I try and do the exercises because they're usually useful. And the idea development canvas was really useful for this. And I plotted it out. And the idea there is that you run through a canvas, and if you Google idea development canvas, I'm pretty sure this is an open source one, you'll find one like this. It takes you to the next stage of developing an idea. So that's the idea. You might slow down, and instead of thinking, how do I get to the end of the idea? You think, how do I get to the next stage? What's the next stage of development? And I was kind of particularly umming and ahhing about, how do I know if I've chosen the right people, or if I have accidentally excluded somebody that I should be inviting? And Amaya said, well, you don't worry about that, because this is the first experiment of this, and you'll see how it goes, and then you'll make some changes after that. And so that is an important thing to say about this episode, but also about the next year of the show. It's going to be an experiment. We've got no idea how it's going to go. What we're going to do is each of these people that you're going to meet a little bit more today are going to interview at least 3 guests over the next year. But also before that, so that you can get to know them, I'm going to interview each of them. So that's another episode, more episodes that you've got to look forward to. So that's why we're not going to do great detail of who everybody is in this call. But we are going to do a little bit more of who everybody is in a few minutes. And already what I can feel, like I've said, is my energy has shifted around the show. Lots more, I think, interesting stuff will happen. There's other things that I've been working on. As part of this process, it's been interesting for me to slow down on the coaching work that I've been doing this year. So Miles Downey's been my coach this year. Some people will remember him from the interview I did with him. And one of the exercises he did with me was, it's a cool exercise, essentially a visualization exercise with some question prompts. And the rule is, it's such a great thing. He said it to me, and then I really felt it. The rule is you have to tell me the first image that comes to mind when I ask this question. So you listen for an image. You have to tell the first one. And so if you want to do this with clients, everybody, it's a cool thing to do. But you have to give them this briefing, because you have to tell the first one, even though you'll probably think it's wrong or it's rubbish. And I did that with all of them. And I'm not going to tell all of them now, but one of them, the question was, where are you going? Something like that. And the image that came to mind was the field out here that I can see, actually, but not as it is. Instead, with hundreds and hundreds of young trees in plastic tree guards. And so that, for me, is a picture of my work, right? It's to grow some trees with tree guards to the point where they can grow on without me at the moment when I'm no longer around. And that's part of what this is for me, where we're creating now. We're doing the first stage of that. Can the coach's journey, grow into something that can survive by itself? And we're doing some tree guard stuff for that at the moment. And we'll see a few more changes probably in the first few months of next year, with some extra things that'll go on the website and some tweaks to the community and the membership and the supporters and how that works. But that essentially, I think, tells us the story of how we got here and what we're going to do. So then there's two questions for the team that are here. One, is there anything obvious that I've forgotten? And then it'd be lovely to hear, a reflection from each of you on the story of how we got this far, what you noticed from your side of it, or something that you noticed from the way that I told the story now or another time. Who wants to jump in first? Alex.
I think one of the things for me, I love the idea of the trees, first of all, like those young trees and that protective plastic, and I think we could stretch that in so many ways. But I feel like I'm one of those trees, and everybody who listens to this podcast is one of those trees. And I think that's one of the beauties of what you've really created here, Robbie, is that what I like about the coach's journey and the coach's journey community is it really feels like something that you can dip into and out of as much as you want and as much as works for you. And that can be at different stages of your journey. So, for example, for me, I've known you for a while, since before you were a coach. And I was following the podcast and learning about coaching when I was deciding to become a coach. And then I became a member of the community when I was more seriously going into coaching, taking my next steps, going through my training, etc. And so I think one of the things that will be really nice about having us on the show is kind of an exploration or an explanation of what it's like to be part of that community from our perspective. Because for me, when I was writing down what the community meant for me, I was thinking it could be a whole podcast on its own, because it's got so many different facets to it. And the simplest one for me is that before I joined the coaching sector, and before I joined your community in particular, I didn't really think of myself as a groups person. I can be a lone wolf in many ways. And this group and subsequent other groups I found in the coaching community have made me feel quite differently about that. And I think that's a pretty high recommendation for what you've created. And it also gives people perhaps some insights about, a lot of us are working as freelancers or in small groups. It gives a bit of insight about why that might be important to people working in the way that we're working. And so from my perspective, being able to share that a little bit with other people who are less familiar with your work is a real joy. And so it's wonderful to be involved.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And actually, let's maybe do a thing we were talking about doing before the podcast. Let's maybe do it now. Actually, I think that, because the way you did that then, Alex, was just really nice. So we're going to use, everybody, the question. we're going to use the question that we always use on the show to start this. Oh, no, we're not. I was laughing to myself because that is a callback that only people who went to Settle High School in North Yorkshire between the years like 1970 and 2005 will get, because that is a thing that John Ketchell, legendary teacher who like taught my friend Victoria's mum and Victoria, used to do all the time. He would be teaching maths and he would go, today we're going to talk about, oh, no, we're not. And once he even in an assembly, he started the assembly that he was delivering saying, today we're going to talk about BLT. And my friend Dean leaned over straight away. He got it. He was like, oh, no, we're not. And then Ketchell said, oh, no, we're not. We're going to talk about LBT, leatherback turtles. And then he went on this amazing 15-minute environmental crusade about how we shouldn't buy swordfish from Booths, which is the posh Northwest supermarket, because when you buy swordfish from Booths, you're essentially killing dolphins. So this is why we love the Coach's Journey podcast, because we get enough Ketchell stories. Now we do anyway. So I think what we'll do, we're going to not use where did you first come to coaching? We're going to use where did you first come to the Coach's Journey? Because a really important part of this for me, which is present in what I said about why I chose these people. And I should say also that I did reach out to the rest of, so the only people that know about this really before this episode comes out is the members and supporters of the Coach's Journey podcast. I did say to them in the video, like, if anybody in that group really felt like they wanted to be part of this and aren't, then let me know. So I have like done some due diligence there to make sure that I'm not excluding people too much, albeit we do sometimes we can't have everybody and everything. And for me, one of the reasons that I chose these 5 people is I really trust them to help me grow this thing into something new. Slightly lost my thread there. So let's go straight to the question. No, I've remembered. So one of the things that's really important that we all want from this episode is for you to understand who's going to take this thing on. That as a listener, especially the people that listen all the time, first of all, don't worry, I'm not going to disappear. I'm sure this is going to, when I am interviewing people, it's already happening. It's going to bring much more energy to my interviews that I do. Plus I've got, essentially, I think what will happen is I'll have energy and time to work on other more interesting things than me interviewing people for you and me. But it's really important that we understand, like, who are these people? And one of the things that I think makes it special is they're people for whom this show and the community means a lot in different ways, as Alex just explained. So I'm going to come to you all, in a sec to ask you, where did you first come to the Coach's Journey podcast? You can also answer the question that I asked a little while ago about what have you noticed from the story and the call so far. But I guess the other thing that comes to mind, the thing that's exciting for me about bringing people on that I haven't mentioned, is we're doing something new, as far as I know, in the podcasting space. Like, we're trying to work out, a lot of the time what happens when a host runs out of energy for a podcast is the podcast stops. That's why there are like, if there are 3.2 million podcasts in the world, which I think is about how many there are, like, that's why 3.3 million of them don't run anymore. I'm guessing. I don't know if that's the accurate stat, but I would guess it's something of that order. At least 2 million of them don't run, is because when someone runs out of energy, they stop. And we're trying to do something new. Like, it'll be interesting if Tim Ferriss decides to retire or Brene Brown decides to stop her podcast, what will they do? Will those things just cease to exist? If Glennon Doyle doesn't want to do We Can Do Hard Things, it's called We Can Do Hard Things. Maybe she can hand it over to her, a colleague or a daughter or whatever it is. But we'll find that out, right, when she wants to stop doing that. And we're finding out a little bit, though, doing some innovation here, and that's really exciting for me. And just to look back, interesting for me, like I'm going to ask you guys that question in a minute. Another piece of insight I've had about myself is that the most enjoyable successes for me, which we might some part of on purpose, is always starting things. So in a way, a really cool Robert Holden exercise to do is look back at your last year. What were the most enjoyable successes? What were the most meaningful successes? And make those 2 lists and get at least 10 of each. And then compare those things, and the lists will have some overlap, but way less overlap than I expected when I did that exercise. And the enjoyable ones, the meaningful ones, had a lot of like pushing through, completing things, doing hard bits. The enjoyable ones were all new things. So it really appeals to me that we're doing something new here. So Alex, before we go to the others, is there anything else you want to add to that question, to answer that question about where you came to, where you first heard about the Coach's Journey?
I think the only thing would be to say that, and I imagine this is very much true of the audience, is that we all come to coaching from very different places, like we're all from very different backgrounds. So, I first met you, Robbie, when we were sort of connected to the social sector, working for charities and charitable organizations. And so I think for me, a big part of any coach's journey and the coach journey community for me was just learning that people do come from different backgrounds, and I don't mind sharing this, that when I first came on a community call, the thing that I was wrestling with was really, will everybody be at a much higher level than me? Will everybody be a lot more developed? They've done their training. And what I was thinking about that is, would I be able to show up in a way that gave value to other people? I was sure that I was going to get the value. That was never the question in my head. And so for me, I just think I'd like that to come across to people, like through the community, I've got to know all the wonderful human beings on this call, and all the amazing backgrounds they come from and the things that they then bring to their coaching through those backgrounds. And also, the final thing I wanted to say is just that one of the joys of doing this is having more time to spend with all the people on this call, that creating something new together, learning from each other, doing it in partnership is just beautiful. And I really hope that will come across in the things that we create.
Yeah, lovely. And is this right, Alex? Like, I think you kind of hinted at this, and I remember this, that you did. Was it just through our connection on LinkedIn or wherever that you came across the podcast originally? Because you listened to the podcast before you were really thinking about coaching and joined the community at about that same time, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it was just because we were connected. I liked your work and I started to follow the podcast. Maybe there was sort of a germ of an idea that I wanted to get into coaching in some way. But also for me, genuinely, and I think I told you this at the time, one of the reasons why I wanted to join the community was because I really didn't want the podcast to end. So by being a member, for me, there was two tracks. I could have just supported it as a supporter, which is one option to support it, or I could have got involved in the way that I did. But I remember a consideration for me, aside from the personal stuff of being in the community, was I was getting so much from the podcast as the podcast that I thought, if this community does well, hopefully Robbie's going to keep the podcast going, which is in the same way. Now that we're all doing this, the fact that you're keeping the podcast going is something that I'm very happy to contribute to, because I think it's important and it continues to help me.
Yeah, and I think I've kind of told the story today. It feels true that if the community had petered out at some point in the last, so the community started, I think, in late 2020? No, late 2019 it must have been. So where did the podcast start in 18 then? No, late 2020. Podcast started in 19. We'd have to check that, because Leah was born in 2020, so the community must have started in 2019. Neil, you're going to fact check me?
November 2019, first episode.
First episode, okay. So right. Okay. This is so funny, my memory. Who cares? Let's carry on with the story. I'm just trying to do sums in my head about paternity leave and that kind of thing. They must have, yeah, interesting. So the community came. Oh, I've forgotten when my daughter's born. She was born in late 2020, so that's why. So yeah, the podcast started in 19. The community started in 2020. And in a way, if the community had petered out over that time, I suspect that when I'd been sitting with what happens to the podcast, I might well have said, actually, that, maybe there isn't the appetite for the things I'm creating and doing with coaches. Then there's permission from the universe in that way to say, okay, there's space for something different. But that is not what's happened. And thanks for that. And to everybody who's supported the show financially. And like I said before, by sharing over the years. Joey, I'm curious, when did you come across this thing, the coach's journey?
Well, I had an inkling this question might come up.
Yeah.
So I was walking and thinking, and I realized I don't entirely know. And I thought, well, I can say that because we all said, when you asked us what this thing, the coach's journey is, I think we all came up with either truthfulness, honesty, or integrity as one of our words. And I think it might have been through an organization called Insight Seminars. I knew some of the assistants on there. I did some assisting. I met, I don't think he'd mind me saying his name, some one of the assistants called Ben Carter, who's quite heavily involved with them and knows you, Robbie, and knows Katie Harvey. And I was quite new to coaching and I was looking for a supervisor, and he put your two names forward. And then I got in touch with you, Robbie, and through the gift of the hour-and-a-half coaching session that you do, I think at some point in there you mentioned that you had a podcast, and if I'm really honest, guys, I didn't know what a podcast was, so I didn't really think much of it. And I know for sure that it was at least a year, because I'd moved house and it was a year in between the session and when I first listened. I remember exactly where I was listening to the first episode with Katie, who I'd also been in touch with, so there was this lovely thing of listening to the two of you who I was just starting to get to know. And that's how I first came across it, kind of, I think.
Yeah. I'm sure Ben won't mind that. I mean, there's actually a picture of Ben on the website because he was a part of one of the Coach's Journey group coaching programs, and I grabbed a screen grab of them once. And actually had to Photoshop. It turns out having a screen grab of a Zoom coaching call where people don't know you're doing it is quite hard to have not somebody looking weird. So actually Photoshop a different bit of Ben on, because I had a really good shot of everybody else, but Ben was doing a listening face or something. And so, but yeah, Ben's on there, and a great coach, lovely guy, and yeah, he was definitely how we originally connected, wasn't he? Which is
He's
nice.
a great connector.
And then we get a bit of the sense of how this business works, right? Because there's a move, a bit like Alex said, there's a connect move where we somehow meet, and then there's in my case, sometimes it doesn't have to be. This is not everything for sure, but sometimes there's some content created, which is how you get to know me more. And then sometimes there's an invitation. We did some coaching, as you said, Joey, and we'll get into this more, I'm sure, when we do interview you for the show. But yeah, and then at some point you get these deeper connections, like through the community or now.
Robbie, I wanted to say, I don't think you've yet explained to listeners that you'll be doing a one-to-one, unless I missed it.
I did say it. I'm pretty sure I said it, but we will. We'll do a one-to-one with each of you at different time at some point during the next year, so that basically everybody, before you listen to, let's say, Alex or Joey interviewing somebody, you'll have the opportunity, if you want, to listen to me interviewing them for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and that's a way to get to know them, but also to pull out some of the insights and the different things that they know and that they've learned in their coaching journey so far. And I've only done one of them so far with Alex, but it's been to just think about that and to prepare for them. It's very exciting because it reminds me just what an amazing group of people are on this call. And so I'm so excited to get to introduce you all to more people. Joey, is there anything else from the conversation so far that you want to say before we hear from somebody else?
I love the idea of being part of creating something new with all of you, and you said something about a net, which just reminded me of kind of widening the net, and it just reminded me of a concept I've learned about recently, which is Indra's net. I don't know if it's Hindu or Buddhist, but I imagine it like a beautiful spider's web with like the dewdrops on each of the joins, and it's a bit like, I think, the community that's been created by all of us over this time and led by you, Robbie, but that it's like each of us are playing our little part, and if you slightly knock a jewel on Indra's net or the dew on a spider's web, all the others inevitably shine and sparkle and send off their sparks of light everywhere. And it's a bit like, oh, we're all even more now connecting and widening this net of everybody who listens, who's part of the community, who's part of this thing we call coaching, and maybe even further. And I love it. I love that I've been asked to be part of this, and I love working with you all, and I'm hoping that net's gonna like really wobble and sparkle and shine, and it's quite exciting.
So lovely. Me too. Alex?
Sorry, Joe, I just had to say, I wanted to say this anyway. As soon as you start speaking, you had a rainbow on your hair. At least that's what I'm seeing on my screen. Yeah,
if anyone's watching on video, yeah.
So sorry. Yeah, I was thinking not people would be listening would know, but literally I'd seen that before, but it was on Joey, and then when she was talking about this beautiful and it would affect, and it was literally on your hair. So I thought that was beautifully serendipitous, Joey. So thanks for that image.
Yeah, lovely. Neil, how about you? Where did you first come across the Coach's Journey? And or if you want to go first, what's something that you've noticed or want to pull out from the call so far?
So I'll go in reverse order. The thing I've noticed about the call is the familiar warmth of being amongst this group, and the like the symbiosis of what aspects of the podcast offer in terms of authenticity, realness, connection, access to interesting things and people and discussions, and how that happens in the community. So reconnecting to that, which has been, again, for me, one of the lovely parts about us getting together a few times in preparation for what we're doing with the podcast. And part of the reason I answer the second question first is because I'm still trying to connect to when I first heard about the coach's journey, because there's a variety of different ways it could have been, and I'm not certain which one it was. My sense is that it was accidental in my search for interesting things to listen to as relates to coaching, as I was beginning to spend more time in thinking about coaching, in working in a coaching space. I really invested a lot of resource in what's the stuff I can listen to. I wouldn't say obsessed with podcasts, but there was a long period I had a lot of time I spent listening to podcasts, and find it an enormously powerful way of learning about stuff. And so, although I already knew you before you started the podcast, I think it may have been accidental, and then I reconnected to it in different ways when we began talking more consistently a few years ago. So yeah, I think it was literally typing in podcasts about coaching, so on and so forth, and beginning to explore that world, beginning to bump into the podcasts that many of the training providers have, bumping into This Coaching Life by Phil Goddard, some of the ones that are based in the US, and exploring what I connected to and what was meaningful and had real, genuine depth and value.
So just because my memory, again, we might talk about this more when we do a one-to-one interview with you. My memory is we were originally connected by a woman called Claire Antrobus, who is one of these many people from the history of the coach's journey who was nearly on the show and hasn't been for probably boring diary or email reasons or something I can't quite remember. And we spoke before you'd done any coaching training, is that right? But then do you really think that was what it was? Like that you then were just searching for coaching stuff and you found it and then you were like, oh, this is that guy, is that what it was?
Yeah, I think it was. And it, so Claire had delivered a coach training that I participated in. And yes, she connected, or she told me about you and said, here's a guy who's doing a lot of writing around the process and practice of building a coaching business. I think you might find it interesting. Here's his website. Check it out. He's also lovely, and I'm sure would be up for having a chat if you wanted to. And so I had done some training, and yeah, we'd had a couple of conversations, and I think it was before you'd started the podcast. And so you were kind of in my orbit, I guess. But I do think it was accidental. The other thing that occurs as you say that is it might also be perhaps via a YouTube video or something where you mentioned the podcast. There's sort of a variety of different ways. There's not a crystal clear route in to the podcast.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting for me in this moment that we're kind of getting is a flavor of like, how does creating something like this play into your connections with other people? because it's like, yeah, because it's present in all three so far, and I think it's going to be a little different for maybe Alex. Like that, our story, Alex Whitton, is a little different, but I think Ruth will be similar in some ways. Like, it's interesting that it wasn't the reason for Joey, Alex, Swallow, or Neil, but it was a big part of how we got here, of course, but deepening the connection. So it is an interesting thing to think about. Again, I think that distinction that I hinted at between goal work and soul work, which is my attempt to coin a phrase, which I still think is a little clumsy and that probably won't become the new vulnerability or whatever that, that everyone's talking about, but it's good to know what some of the outcomes of making something like this can be, which is that people in your orbit get sucked in. And my understanding, like Neil, you've listened, I mean, as a podcast, someone who has something bordering on podcast obsession, you've listened to quite a few of them, right?
Yeah, I'm confident I've listened. I'm certain I've listened to most of them. It's probable that at some point I've listened to all of them, and I'm not sure I could say that about any other podcasts that are about coaching or that give access to aspects of coaching.
Yeah, which tells us two things. One, there's not so much content that it's impossible to listen to all of it yet, but probably we're going to spoil that next year. And two, that it's obviously excellent is the other thing that you're saying there. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is. Yes, the reality is it is those two things, and I think if I were to define excellent for me in this context, it's about the connection, it's about the realness, and that I am genuinely getting access to the guest's journey, warts and all, the struggle, the beauty, the charm and the challenge, and that it keeps me coming back. I have a firm belief, and indeed central to my practice, is that coaching is relational in all the best ways, and that through the podcast there is an element, as a listener, there's an element of the relational, and it may be on some level parasocial, but still that there is genuine connection there in the way that you have thus far supported people to open up and share parts of their journey.
Yeah. I don't quite, can you just define parasocial for me before I assume I know what it means?
Yeah, so my understanding of it, which as with many things in life that I believe I understand is quite possibly a bit wonky, is that it's essentially through, let's for the sake of argument say, listening to the episode where you interviewed James Bianco, that I build a bit of a connection with him, that I have a sense that I am in some way connected to him. Now, I think it does have some challenging connotations, in as much as I think if you continue to get deeper into the parasocial perspective, it might be that I believe he's my friend, and that indeed he knows about me and has any awareness that I exist in the world. Don't worry, James. I don't expect you to. So I think there is like a kind of like a less rosy part of it that I it might be. I know Robbie and you and I share a great admiration and profound interest in the work of Tim Ferriss, and I think it could be said that I've spent so much time reading and listening to his work that I have because it speaks to me so much, I have a sense that I have a relationship with him, and I hope I'm sufficiently self-aware and boundaried to know that he hasn't the faintest idea that I exist, and indeed that doesn't matter. That's that, and I'm totally okay with that. So I think there are aspects of parasocial that might be problematic, but I think there's positive parts that we can create some connection and meaning making from the access that the podcast gives to the parts of these people's journeys that they're willing to share.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Neil, and it makes me think of Joey's web. Sorry, I know it's not Joey's web, but like for me, it's now Joey's web. or it was a net, wasn't it? Somebody else's net, but Joey's web is now what I'm going to think of it as, Indra's net. Yeah. One of the things I've thought about podcasts for a while is that what's special about them is they let us be part of the kind of conversations we wish we were having more in our lives. And I don't think I've ever said this before, but I had this really profound, like, deepening of that understanding about, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, maybe a bit less. I was just having a tough time. Like, Leah was little, she was really sick. Like, we'd had a rough week for details that I won't go into, but it was like, the nursery had accused her of having chicken pox, which she didn't have, which meant they refused to have her in, on like just genuinely one of the worst weeks of our lives. And it was I got to the end of it. Then my mum came down to help and like passed out like midway through because she wasn't very well. And I was at the end of this day and I've been trying to work, and I put on this podcast that I love. When I need to relax, I listen to these completely geeky guys talking about football. And this is one of their most like indulgent ones, where they were talking about, so it's now, they've rebranded it now. It's a bit of a shame. It used to be called Zonal Marking. Now it's called the Athletics Football Tactics Podcast. But they were obsessing about direct free kicks and whether they're useful or not. And it was just like the most absurd geeky thing in the world. And it was just like an absolute relief, because I was sat washing up at like 11:30 p.m. feeling alone and sad. And then I got to sit in this beautiful, pointless conversation of exactly the kind that I needed. But all the people I actually know who I could have that conversation with were scattered around the country, busy with their own struggles. And that is something that this podcasting thing can create for people. So I sent Ali Maxwell, I had to after that. Like, I sent Ali Maxwell, who's the host of that show, a Twitter DM about it, because he's got it. Like, he doesn't know that their absurd conversation about direct free kicks is helping someone's acute feelings of loneliness. But like, what a thing it is that we can do that. Joey, you were going to say something before.
Yeah, and actually, you just reminded me as you were saying that, and I think what you and Neil have been talking about, I have found. I mean, I don't know who listens to what past podcasts and how often they listen. As I said, I'm relatively new to them. But this podcast, I will listen to easily 2 hours of my time. Just, I think for both the reasons you've just given, they kind of become these really profound, deep, explorative conversations, but they're just really ordinary somehow. I'm not quite sure how that happens, but they're really ordinary. And I don't mean boring. I just mean kind of everyday, nice, comforting to listen to. But actually, I find them, as they kind of stack and build all the different conversations, really deeply encouraging as a coach. It's that encouragement that this is ordinary, this is human, this is humanity, this is what we do, this is what we're contributing to as coaches. And I found that, really powerful, actually, really interesting and powerful and comforting and all the different things.
Ruth, how about you? What were you going to say then? Or if you want to move into reflections on the conversation so far, or where you came to this thing we call the coach's journey.
Yeah, sure, I will. But I just wanted to know if I was going to say boring football guy then, and then I stopped myself.
Yeah, good save.
If the football podcast guy did reply to your DM.
Yeah, he said, "Wow, thank you so much for saying that. I'm so glad that our entirely frivolous conversation is meaningful, and I hope Leah gets better soon." It's a really nice message. He's a lovely man. Yeah. And he is very boring if you find football boring, as we are probably.
Oh, I do.
Or maybe not. I was going to say as we are if you find coaching boring, but I think there's one of the reflections is, like, I've had people listen to this show who aren't really coaches, who have said that they love these conversations. So I think it's maybe we're not boring in the way, because they're human stories, whereas obsessing about direct free kicks is only interesting to a certain corner of the population. Ruth,
I don't even know what direct free kicks are.
Exactly. I remember once
the opposite of indirect, one assumes.
I don't think this is breaching confidentiality. At the end of a community call once, it was just before England were playing, and we started having a conversation about it in the last 30 seconds, and Ruth was like, "Right, I'm off." Hang up straight away.
Yeah, it's not my zone of genius or interest.
Well, it might be true for other listeners. This is why it's important to have a pool of hosts, so not too much of it digresses into
Football or
Old
Star
chat.
Trek.
Exactly. We had a brief Star Trek story before the recording switched on, didn't we? Which we won't repeat for listeners in case
No, we won't.
that's too much. Ruth, either is there something that's really standing out for you from the conversation so far, and or where did you come to the coach's journey?
I think Neil summed it up with the term familiar warmth that we've had on all our team calls regarding the podcast, but is also present when we have our community calls as well, which is absolutely part of the value of that. Where did I come? How did I come to the Coach's Journey podcast?
Yeah, where did you first hear about it? Why did you listen? Or why did you contact me? We could do that if you want.
Okay. My mum.
Yeah.
Really?
Mums are here as part of this conversation, aren't they? Between Ruth
Yeah,
and I.
they definitely
Brilliant.
are. Yeah, it must have been spring, summer in god awful 2020. Although, some of it wasn't awful. Finding the Coach's Journey podcast wasn't awful. Because during lockdown, I'd started being interested in coaching. And sort of I'm that person that when I'm interested in something, I just hoover everything up and look for everything. So I must have been talking to my mum about coaching, and she said, oh, and mentioned the name of her friend and said that this friend's son does coaching. And that friend's son was Robbie.
It's like all great friendships start because your mums are friends, right?
Yeah, definitely. So straight away, because I was in proper Hoover sponge mode. Wow. I just Googled Robbie's name, found the website. And then I think I went straight to the podcast because I'm just going to put it out there. I am obsessed with podcasts. There's no bordering on obsession.
Ruth, before we go on, tell us some of your other favorite podcasts. I'm assuming that the Coach's Journey is one of your favorites in that question. I'm going to keep with that assumption, but tell us some of your other, like Neil's mentioned the Tim Ferriss show. What are some of your favorites?
Yeah, Tim Ferriss definitely up there, but I've also really enjoying kind of more alternative stuff at the minute. There's Maintenance Phase, which is about kind of debunking wellness and anti-fat bias, and that's really opened my eyes about how I think about fat people, which has been really interesting. And they're both just really funny. I just kind of want to sit and have a glass of wine with them and laugh with them. Also, another one is Conspirituality. You can see there's a bit of a debunking conspiracy thing here. Not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, quite the opposite. So those ones are big at the minute, but also I'm lapping up true crime.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, once you've listened to Serial, you kind of can't.
Yeah,
can't go back on that stuff, can you?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely totally podcast obsessed and proud of it. So I went straight to the Coach's Journey podcast, and I just remember I probably bosh. There was probably 30 episodes then, and I probably boshed them all in a couple of months. And then, and I don't want to say too much about my favorite episode because I think we'll come into that, but it was it was that certain episode that then made me reach out to you, Robbie.
Well, let's do that one now because it's part of the story, and then we can come back. We can come back in more detail later on if you want. What was because I love that. I love that you reminded me of this memory recently, right? And I'd forgotten it, but it was you wrote about it. I think in probably the first email contact that we had. So yeah, what was the moment for you that sparked that email or that favorite episode?
Just let me check, because you talked about the neighbours and a pneumatic drill.
Yeah, we can't hear we can't hear okay, your neighbours' pneumatic drill. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, before we switched on, listeners, I was just saying, I didn't say, like, it's hard enough to get all 6 of us on a call at the same time. The idea that we might get through it without someone's neighbours starting to use a pneumatic drill is laughable, or someone's internet being destroyed. So we'll see if we do. But so far, so good. Yeah. What was that episode, Ruth?
It was the Joel Monk episode. And interestingly, because I knew I was going to talk about it today, I've re-listened to it. And that's just been like crazy in a wonderful way.
What was it like, and what stood out from that episode looking back? So yeah, for people who let me do a little bit. People who don't know, I remember that one as one of the first, as number 5 or 6, I think. And Joel, if I had to point at the people who aren't family members who have had the biggest impacts on my life, like so many of my stories about the things that I'm doing now and the successes I've had start with, I was once doing this coaching session with my coach at the time, Joel Monk, and we get into that a bit in that episode. But yeah, Ruth, for you, what was meaningful about that episode, or what stands out for it, stood out for it as you listen back?
Well, I kind of need to go back to the first time I listened to it first, because it was a rainy day during lockdown, and as usual, I would walk wherever. And this time I happened to be down by the canal in the rain.
In Leeds, right? Leeds is where you live. Yeah?
In Leeds, yeah. In the rain. And just hearing Joel talk with such passion about coaching just like floored me. And for the first time really in my adult life, I felt so strongly that coaching was something I wanted to do. And not, when I said first time in my adult life, like I remember being a kid and thinking I wanted to be an actor and a performer, and knowing that like so fully within myself. And then obviously times change, and I changed, and that desire waned. And at no point during, and I've done work in my adult life that has been fulfilling and enjoyable, but at no point have I ever felt that like complete knowing of this is what I want to do. And that just hit me by the canal in the rain, and I just started crying. So I got home, and I think that's when I emailed Robbie and was waffling on about, oh my God, you're going to think I'm some crazy canal crying woman. Which you probably do still think that.
I only invite crazy canal crying women to be part of my
the coach's
and men
journey.
to be part of a coach's journey. Yeah.
And there's a nice lot of alliteration there as well. And yeah, that's what kind of pushed me to reach out to you. So to then listen back to it 3.5 years later, when I'm now working, almost full time as a coach, feeling that stuff that Joel talks about is just, it was a real sort of, I don't know, like a line in the sand, like listening back to that. That's not the right word. It'll come to me. To listen back 3.5 years later and to have actually achieved what it was that made me cry is pretty cool. And also
everyone's nodding. Listeners, it is pretty cool.
Yeah, and to listen back, because since listening, I've trained on working as a coach, to then listen back to the more technical stuff about it, and be able to really tune into that side of it was really good as well, like the somatic stuff and that embodied coaching. But also what's amazing is that you recorded that. I don't know when you recorded it. I think it went out in January 2019. And you and Joel are talking about a VUCA world. And I'm thinking, you ain't got any fucking idea how volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous life is just about to become.
Yeah.
So that was a really interesting way to listen to it as well. But yeah, I think that's absolutely my favorite episode, and essentially what pushed me to reach out to you. And Joel, I've written it down because when I listened to it again, it's funny, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment that made me cry. I think it was earlier on, but this time what really stood out to me is Joel talks about our own embodiment into the fullness of who we are. And that just like slapped me around the face in a really good way. Because that, like, I feel like I'm getting there at 44, like embodying the fullness of myself.
And I think if any of us get there at any point, that's just like a beautiful, amazing achievement.
I
love hearing this reflection on that episode, Ruth, because it's funny, like that. I kind of forgotten that was the start of that email until we were of our correspondence until we were talking about it the other week. And mostly what I remember of feedback about that episode is I won't name the person because they didn't say it publicly. Somebody else who's been a member of the community at different times once saying to me, I love the Coach's Journey podcast. This was early days, like probably when that episode had just come out. I've listened to all the episodes apart from the one with Joel Monk, which I just couldn't get through. It's
Isn't
just
it
like,
amazing?
so I have that in my mind. It's funny, in my mind, my body, my memory of that, which is like, I can kind of get that because, Joel, one of the things I love about him is he can take us into he can take us out of the practical really quickly and into that kind of really deep stuff like you're talking about, but that's not for everybody. But yeah, this makes me excited, right? Because I'm like, wow, it's probably time we spoke to Joel again on the show, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I thought exactly that.
He's changed, his work has changed.
Maybe I could interview him.
Maybe we could do it together. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? There we go, team. Obviously, Joel hasn't said yes. He may not say yes.
No,
but like lots of ideas for this podcast, they don't always come off, but you've got to have the idea. So I love it, Ruth. Thanks for sharing that. Alex Whitton, it's been a long time since you spoke on this call. I guess to slow us down in this moment, it'd be lovely to hear what you've noticed, like what's really stood out from this conversation, and then something about how you came across this thing, the Coach's Journey. And also, it was Alex who gave us that question, like the reframe from we want to save. How did you come to coaching for the one-to-one interview? So what's a frame for this, for getting to know you all in this episode? And it's such a good one. Yeah, Alex, what are you noticing?
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Yeah, I love what Ruth was saying, because that's probably a summary of how I came to the community group calls, in the same way that I don't know what specific episode, but I was like, this Robbie is onto something. These people are really interesting. They're really human. Definitely. And when you were talking at the very beginning, Robbie, you were talking about process and the opportunity to share people's journeys and process. I was like, well, actually, I'd like to maybe go through some of the process in a similar space, which then became me joining the group. But that's kind of the ending. The other thing I noticed when you were talking, which feels pertinent, is I've got this image of when you were talking about resistance. Resistance in my head can manifest almost like like a knot that if you leave it was or like jumbled wires like mine were before this call, it will just smooth itself out over time. And that'd probably be the story of me coming to the coach's journey, because the first time I heard of the podcast was on the Mo Foundation alumni Facebook group, which is where I did my coaching training. One of the lead.
Just say something about Mo, just for people who don't know it, because I think it's a really interesting organization. And for some listeners, like when you're a coach, you often get asked about where do you recommend people change? And there's some interesting things about Mo that I think, like, if you could say a few words about it so that people can look that up if they want to, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I'll declare my bias in that I still do some training with Mo because I think they're wonderful. But Mo Foundation is a charity that basically delivers really affordable coaching training with a focus on people that either work with young people or in the youth space to empower the next generation of young people. And essentially going through that training, which is why I did my coaching training, you then become part of the alumni group. I'm sure Robbie will probably talk way more about Mo when we do our one-to-ones.
Yeah, and people like you might be about to say this, but if people want to hear, is this what you're about to say next? Is that how you? So presumably, was it Katrina who posted in the alumni Facebook group, or how did it?
It was actually Jeffrey.
Was it right?
Yeah.
So okay, so yeah, you can check out if you want to hear Mo. Is Jeffrey a Mo graduate as well? I didn't remember that.
He's definitely a lead trainer. I don't know if he's a Mo graduate.
Yeah. So Jeffrey Wotherspoon. But I thought you might be talking about Katrina Horry, who was guest number 4, I'm going to say, or 5. 4, Alex says, yeah. And still is one of the ones that has a funny little spike. If you look at the listener stuff, Katrina's one, and it's interesting to try and work out why this is. It might be just she repeatedly publicizes it to Mo people she's training, but in the listener stats for the coach's journey, the most listened to in any month is like the latest one and episode 1, because there's a bunch of people who come to the show who listen to the latest one because it's just come out, and then there's a bunch of people who come to the show and go back to start at the beginning. And then it drops off a little bit with episode 2 and 3, and then spikes with 4 for Katrina. And I think my guess would be there's 2 reasons for that. One is she shares it with people who are on the Mo Foundation training that she often facilitates, and the other is it's a really beautiful conversation that I absolutely love. It was one of the first ones where I thought, wow, we've created a picture of this person that I didn't know I don't know if she feels like this, but I felt like I knew her a bit because we were kind of neighbors. But although we didn't realize it when we first connected, which is a funny story, we lived like 800 meters from each other, but we both traveled into the middle of London in order to meet because we hadn't realized that we lived so near each other. But yeah, there's something about that we really get to the core of who she is in that conversation, which I think is really beautiful. So that might be why. But sorry, Alex, I interrupted. So it's Jeffrey who posted about his appearance on the show.
Jeffrey shared his episode, and this the funny part of the story, I must admit I've never listened to, because this was the point at which I was perhaps like playing with the idea of exploring coaching, something I wanted to pursue as my business, and I was like, oh, this looks great, I'll listen to it on my lunch break. I opened it and went, 1.5 hours. It's my lunch break. But to that resistance and those kinks, they're definitely like, it hadn't smoothed out enough to go, you know what, I'm going to give it this time to really explore this. And actually,
and you didn't realize yet that 1.5 hours is like the shortest episode of the Coach's Journey podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And fast forward where I've not quite got to Jeffrey's because I'm one of those people that went back to the beginning and worked through and listened to some more recent ones as well, just to see when you were talking about how they've perhaps changed over time. But instead kind of went to, and partly probably because I wasn't that familiar with podcasts, and the ones I listened to were very rugby focused. I'll pause there in case it's too much sport for one call. And
Ruthie, are you going to hang up if we talk about rugby? Yeah, she's doing a board expression. We'll have a separate one where I interview you and Joey about your rugby involvements, and we talk about that and its relationship to coaching.
That will definitely be 4 hours long. Yeah. And, no one will listen to it except for me.
But by the way, endorsement. You'll love this, Alex and Joey. Endorsement on Claire Pedrick's latest book, Lucia Baldelli's Lewis Moody. Because he's done some coaching training. So that's a little, I think, because that's a little aside. I'm sorry, Alex, we're interrupting. Let's not do too much rugby. We're in danger of losing Ruth and 3/4 of the listeners. So you found a space to absorb these long form interviews. I'm going to say something about long form, short form in a sec. I think that's a really interesting part of this whole thing for us, for podcasting. But what else did you want to say?
Well, so before that, I then just had the website up and read the How I Became a Full-Time Coach in 2 Years article. So I was like, well, what does this coaching thing really involve? Because I was then at that point of, well, I really love doing this thing, coaching. What could it be? And by chance, another coach posted on the Mo alumni Facebook group, who is also called Alex. But as this call shows, more people than just Alexes can be coaches.
I think it shows that, doesn't it? But it does help. Yeah. Love to all the Alex coaches out there. I had an embarrassing moment actually on a coach's journey call with several Alexes when I had to admit that Alex was really high up our list of names for our not because of you, I promise, but maybe because of you, for our second child. Alex, sorry, I keep interrupting.
No. It's just your life must be so saturated with Alexes that it's like your peripheral vision.
Yeah.
But no, and he was just starting out his own coaching practice, and I messaged him on Facebook going, "Oh, would love to hear how it's going." And he went, I think I was talking around like marketing stuff, like how do you find what you do as a coach? And he suggested the Allegra Stain episode and the first one, and the Toku McCree episode. And I was like, and at that point I was more in it. And so this sort of jumbled kink analogy, it definitely sort of smoothed out enough. I was like, you know what, I'm now going to smooth this out myself. I'm going to sit down and listen to these episodes. I listened to both of those, and at that point went, right, you know what, I think it was just Allegra's. Let's do this from the beginning. And must have been a lot of the episodes people have mentioned. So Joel's, James Bianco's, actually, Catriona Horry's were all really resonant, I think. And at that point I went, I think this was a year into actually working my business. I was like, I want more of this, to the point you were saying would be about process. That's why I found the community. Join the overall community, and I think in part because what I loved and what feels different about all of this to some of the other coaching stuff I listen to is that it's really human. I think I can find it really challenging to see myself as someone who could be anything, let alone a coach. And to actually hear stories, I always reference the Phil Bolton one, where part of his original coaching bit, I spent loads of time watching Bargain Hunt. And there was something really human about like the process and the way that everyone found their way in terms of who they are as a coach and how they did it, that I thought, actually, imagine being part of that in a like live, living, organic way by joining kind of the community and those group calls, as well as listening to the episodes. That is then kind of, well, if these people are where I might like to be, the people here within this group are in their own way navigating that journey. And so being able to share that and be part of it was really wonderful. And I think like the way it humanized that process was, I suppose, what got me to here and got me through the 1 hour and a half. And now I'll just churn through those 2-hour calls. Bread and butter.
And look, you might have just said this, Alex, because my attention went a tiny bit there, which is like, this is like practicing what I preach. Sometimes say that to clients. It's a bit edgy, but it's like, I wouldn't know. Like, you might have just said this, but what you said made me think was that is also about what you all coming on board is for me. It's like we get the process again at different stages, and therefore the curiosity about different things coming in different ways. And I'm really excited for all that. I think it was so beautiful hearing Ruth's story about your favorite episode. It would be great to hear some of those other stories in a minute. But I wanted to say something about short form, long form, because I think it is a really interesting thing. It used to happen all the time in the first, I don't know, like probably in those first few months where it was fortnightly, and then into that first year, I used to get messages all the time saying, I love your podcast, but why is it so long, essentially? Or can you make it shorter? And my response was no, I cannot and will not. Now, I'm a little looser around that now, but, first of all, I think it's like I find it a really, I got into saying this a little bit, which is probably a little bit too sharp with people, but it's like a real, what did I say, like victim response. Just listen to it in 2 sittings. Like there's some psychological thing that makes it really difficult for people to deal with a 2-hour episode. Just if you want an hour episode, you've got 2 here. Just listen to them, and that's my kind of slightly direct way of saying it. But, Spotify allows you to listen up to like 5 speed. You could listen to it. I mean, you can't actually understand it when it's going at 5 speed, especially if I'm talking. But, with people who talk more slowly, which is be a great thing. I reckon, having a more diverse group means you might be able to listen to some of these on 3 times. But even me, you can listen to on 1.8 or 2. And I think one of the things we'll play with, Ruth, you were asking this when we were first talking about the show, like, do they have to be really long? And the answer is, of course, no. And I think we'll play with that with different formats over the next year. I suspect some months we'll actually release more than 2 episodes, partly because I've got a load of short episode ideas that I think will come out as probably little bonus episodes. And again, that's some of that release of energy from the having to keep it going will allow for that much more, I think. But I like, for example, I love the Diary of a CEO thing. I mean, I don't love it as a listener. I skip them and never listen to them. But I love the idea of the thing that he does, which is pull out like 90 seconds of somebody and look, here's this 90-second version of my sprawling conversation with whoever. And although I got really annoyed when I was trying to find a guest on Diary of a CEO, and I found that I could only find their like little tiny bit. I was like, well, where's the whole thing? It is great to expose from the middle of these sprawling real conversations, like the amazing little insight that might be in there. So we might have some fun with that. And if listeners are listening and they can think of, like, maybe we'll find that bit of Joel's episode and we'll like make it into a little clip. But if anybody's got some bits of their favorite moments, not just episodes from the show, that they think other coaches would love to have pulled out, then by all means, let us know. Before we do some more favorite episodes, is there anything else that anyone wants to kind of pull out or reflect on in this moment? In that case, I mean, I can choose, but who's got a favorite episode that they'd love to talk about? I choose Neil. Too late, Alex and Joey, putting your hands up.
So James Bianco and Phil Bolton, neck and neck. James wins as favorite episode, but I would be doing the episode with Phil, and I mean the early one. I think it was episode 2 of him on his own. The other one that he does with his colleague, whose name currently escapes me.
Inga, yeah. There's a more recent one if people are interested in that, where we catch up with Phil a little bit on where he was, but yeah.
And it's also magnificent. So I'll speak to the James Bianco one. And I think what really struck me was, here is a person who is like really in the thick of building a coaching business and understanding what that means for them, deep in the process, and is thinking, like, is able to share a rigorously considered and well thought through understanding of where they've got to. And so I was really struck by the extent to which the story was both interesting and I could extract actionable insights from it. That I could go, like, I judge this person. So an example would be, and a theme for me early in my coaching journey, and indeed one that persists, is I took the choice to move into the necessity of making a sufficient financial return from the business quite early on and quite quickly. and like many people have a reasonable level of financial commitments that I need to meet on a monthly basis. And I think I was really struck by James also sharing that in his episodes, and looking at ways of not muscling building a big business, but rather being real. Again, it's back to this relational piece of where am I at now? And this touches on the reason that James, for me, slightly pips Phil at the post is I noticed when Phil was doing the same thing and talking about the same thing and talking about the challenges of ending up sitting watching Bargain Hunt because things weren't quite going the way that he wanted in his business, he also had this depth of pure coaching experience from his time in Deloitte, where he was coaching internally, and in his first year had amassed like an extraordinary sum of client hours, somewhere close to 1,000 is my memory. Whereas James, by comparison, was like he was driving the car and building it at the same time. He didn't already have a car to drive in. The vehicle of his business was, in the early days, relatively light on client hours, which I think is common for coaches, and really spoke to me. Although I'd been doing some internal coaching, it wasn't close to 100 hours, never mind 1,000. And although I'd been leading in a coaching style for a number of years, the teams that I was working with, I didn't have that depth of experience. So those are the things top of mind at the moment that that really struck me about his episode.
Yeah, there's a beautiful humility to James. I know James pretty well, like as that episode will come across, but since then I did quite a lot of group supervision, where James was a member along with our another good friend Nicole Brigandy, and there's a real great humility to James, which I think is some of that thing about like, I thought that's what you're going to say. I know the depth of client hours is there as well, but for me, there's like a difference. I don't know. I think James sometimes, like lots of great coaches, doesn't quite know how awesome he is. And Phil, in a really, not in a bad way, in a really good way, knows on some level how awesome he is. And so that's somehow makes, for me, sometimes those things somehow more relatable. When I'm feeling like I'm not awesome, when I'm feeling like I'm awesome, I love other people who are feeling awesome as well. I think it's really, I'm going to try and remember to send this to James. Maybe I'll send him this episode when it's out, because I'm pretty sure at the end of that, after we'd switched off, like you said, rigorously considered and well thought through sense of where he's got to. My feeling was that it wasn't the internal experience of James Bianco at that stage. And I think particularly what's nice about remembering that and some of those early episodes and some of the later ones too, is James wasn't somebody who'd been interviewed a lot. So it's a different experience. It's like, you know, when you're interviewing somebody, I don't remember this specifically with James, but when you're interviewing somebody who hasn't been interviewed a lot, you're kind of really having to hold them through quite a terrifying potential experience. Like you five are doing remarkably well on the outside from where I'm sitting on the other end of Zoom in this call, because it's quite something to be to have that spotlight turned on you. And some people, you know, if you listen to the interview that I did with Jamie Smart or Marsha Reynolds, you know, they've been interviewed 1,000 times by the time I interview them, and they're great conversations and we get to some great places in them, but there's a different feel to them to James or Katrina, who we were talking about before.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things, again, it's sort of using this framework of the comparison between Phil and James. Like my memory is, in Phil's episode, he was perhaps 13 years deep into his coaching business. James was 5, and there's a freshness to his thinking in real time. So although the things he was saying came across as well thought through, I think the well thinking through was happening in the moment. Here is a structured thinker, capable of real-time processing, and there's a freshness and an aliveness to that. And in some respects, again, it's my favorite episode, so inevitably it's speaking to a number of things about me. One of the things it touched on was, here's also a fully formed human being who's had a substantial career and is now able to see 5 years in, which I can't when I'm earlier in my journey listening to this yet, but this is beginning to open up for me. Even though I might not have been a a pure coach for over a decade, there's a whole host of things that come from my earlier career that are absolutely relevant and indeed will show up both in liminal and subliminal ways in my coaching powerfully and in my business. His articulation of the depth of network through his time at the civil service and working internationally was like, to this point about being slapped around the face in a good way, it was like, oh yeah, I did work in a particular set of industries for 20 years and spoke to people and hopefully behaved like a decent human being and have remained in touch with many of those people. And they are also humans who have needs, and this wonderful thing called coaching might be able to support them. So yeah, all of that stuff really connecting to where I was at back when I listened to it a few years ago was enormously powerful.
Yeah, it's great stuff. So much stuff we could talk about that, but we can just leave people. We can leave that for another time, Neil, for when we're speaking. But we can leave people to go back and listen to James, because it makes me want to go and listen to that conversation. Like I love that man in lots of ways, but and it makes me want to talk to him as well. So maybe I'll do that. Although we're getting a few too many of those, aren't we, from this conversation, from remembering it for my time. But it is, yeah, it's like, and I think you've spoken there, Neil, to some of the things that make this podcast important, which is the people at a range of stages in the show, and I guess we heard it a bit from Ruth, like what's it like to listen to an episode at one stage of your journey and then another stage. And I imagine that we'll hear different things from Phil when we're 10 years in compared to when we're like, listening when we're 3 years in, or what I'd been 4 years in when I interviewed Phil. I'm 8 years in now. It's like a different picture at that stage. And it's why it's important. Like one of the things that happened, what I loved about, we started brainstorming, you started just bringing to me or to us to meetings some of the guests you might want to speak to or an interview as part of the show. And we're not going to talk too much about that in this episode because they're not all confirmed and we don't know who's going to be when and all that kind of thing. But one of the things that really stood out for me was some of them were people that had been on my list of potential guests since the very start of the show. I started compiling who would I love to have on, and some of them were people who had pitched to be on the show, and I had never invited the first lot for whatever reasons, or hadn't yet interviewed the people who wanted to be on the show. And as soon as the idea was that it might be Neil interviewing that person, or Joey interviewing that person, or Ruth interviewing that person, or Alex. In fact, Alex, one of your first ones, is one of those people I've had on the Alex Whitton that I've had on the list since the very start. I was like, I can't wait to listen to that show with Alex interviewing this guest in a way that I was not excited to do the interview. Not that I wouldn't have had an amazing conversation with her. So I just think that speaks in some ways to that complexity of the kind of all the different lines you can have between where we're at in our journeys and where the person we're speaking to or the person who's the guest on the podcast is at. So thanks for bringing all that in, Neil. Alex Whitton, I'm going to come to you. Did you already mention that you're one of your favorite episodes from the show, or is there one that stands out?
When I actually have a kind of a pair, and it was one of my Coach's Journey binges. So, and they were back to back, which I thought was really interesting. And it was the Chris Joseph episode and then the Giovanna Capozzo one. And I thought were really interesting. Firstly, Chris's story is really interesting. The whole Ponzi, if you just create a clickbait title from Ponzi scheme to prosperous coach, that would be a great one.
Well, that would have been better. That's slightly better than what we've got. I think that's what we should have gone for, isn't it? Yeah, we went around on the title for that. Chris actually came up with the title for that episode because we were just gonna really emphasize that he talked about failure loads, and thought we'd better check that with him before we made the title of the episode just about failure. But it is an incredible story, the Ponzi scheme thing. In that episode, you can really feel the energy of what the personal transformation that had to come for him through going through that pretty traumatic series of events. Sorry, Alex, though, I'm interrupting.
What Chris's story was both excellent. I really enjoyed his presence on the call, and in part because, and this is why I like the episodes together, when then Chris talks about his plans for the future, I think his staffing program cost him like £80,000, and he was talking about his first £1 million program, but did it in such a way of presence, and having heard his journey and his mindfulness based kind of background, you completely understood. It was like, I understand the value that you're offering and bringing here, which I think topples often that coaching industry perception of like, you need to charge X amount. And it's like this ludicrously high fee thing. And with Chris, you understood who he was seeking to serve and how. There was another insight I really liked from it in that, inviting someone to coaching is a gift. And so often we're like, please, might you maybe come to this session I'd love to give you? Whereas actually recognizing the value you bring. But then to put that alongside the Giovanna episode, where she'd also worked in kind of a high fee coaching space, but was very much challenging the bubble of coaching as I think it's often hard to get out of the mindset that to be a good coach, you have to charge high fees, and this sort of the merit of you as a coach is the fee you charge. And I thought was really interesting because I think there's a really important movement or shift to how can coaching be more accessible, but also for someone within that space to kind of stand and challenge it, and also to hear how she was bringing coaching into other aspects of her work. So she'd gone from being almost like full-time coach into coach that's using it in a practice. Was it with a niece or a family member in a wellness practice was also fascinating. And I thought those two together, I mean, there's so many more insights. We could do a 2-hour call on them. That'd be a fun thing, actually, if we just, the meta call on the episode, like the Coach's Journey podcast group. But anyway, that's an aside.
I think it's like a cool idea. And I would, again, one of the things about doing this all together is we don't know, I don't think I really said this, like I mentioned it a little bit, we don't know where this is going to end, and we don't know where it's going to go. And we might, it doesn't feel like it now that we've got this far into it, and feeling the energy, we might decide to wrap up in a year, or by that point we might have done another 15 interesting things and see lots more coming. But I think, yeah, there's definitely like listen back. It's like watching people play computer games on YouTube, which I understand is what young people do. It's like the equivalent of that. We can definitely get to that. Thanks, Alex. Alex Swallow, what about you for favorite episode?
I'm quite impressed with people who've managed to narrow it down, because I had 4. So, but I'll just mention them very briefly for different and related reasons. Mine were Kim Morgan, Chris Joseph, Toki McCree, and Robert Stevenson. So Kim's one, I ended up. She started Barefoot Coaching. I ended up training with Barefoot Coaching, and I think that might have been the first time I've heard of Barefoot Coaching. So that was amazing. And also really amazing for me is that there are other people in the community, including Ruth, who had been through Barefoot Coaching. Their recommendation to me was really important. So that's one of the other things I got out of the community. All of these 4 people have just had, I thought, really big personalities in different ways, but they were very, very different from each other. And so to give Toku as an example, I find a lot of Toku's approach quite challenging to me. And I find Toku fascinating because he's a person who I think just seems naturally intimidating. Like, people find him naturally intimidating, which I find fascinating because he's clearly a lovely guy, really interesting guy, very intelligent person. And so I really liked that kind of seeing somebody who had a very different approach to the one that I would take, who had built a very successful coaching business, had real integrity, fascinating background, 2 years in a Zen monastery. And one of the things that I've really liked about all these people, really, and really about the show, and it really goes back to that parasocial term, which I'd never heard before Neil used, although he used it in another call we had. So I looked it up. I still didn't understand it, so I'm very happy we got to it today. Oh, Joey remembers that too. So for me, I not only feel that when I hear someone on the podcast, I have a potential, it feels like I've got a relationship with them, I've got some understanding of them. But one of the things I did is that I've used it to connect to people. So, for example, being a member of a community, I've connected to people on LinkedIn. And Chris Joseph, Toki McCree, and Robert Stevenson, I've all connected personally with in some way. Toku, I was on his beta reading list for his book, for example. Kim Morgan, I actually haven't spoken to in person, but I feel quite connected to because now I've been through a coaching program. And so for me, I feel that a lot of what's interesting for me about other coaches, I want to really know the person behind the coach. And that's what I think the podcast really gives a lot of people. And for me, being able to connect to people, even on a personal basis, even in a really small way, I'm not saying all these people would remember me, but in a really small way, is fascinating and really helpful. And I learn a lot, not just from what people say, but what people do. And so seeing how people actually build their businesses, actually do things and do it with integrity has been key to the start of my own journey in the coaching space.
Amazing. Thanks, Alex. I feel like we could jump in on lots of those things, but for people who might be coming to this episode as the first one, that we don't want them to have too much of that feeling that Alex Whitton had when he came across it. So we're going to have to stop at some point. So we can come back to those conversations another time. But I love that we've got Kim Morgan in there. I love that one or two, and that we've mentioned Toku and Robert, because again, all great episodes. Joey, how about you? What is there an episode that stands out for you or is particularly meaningful?
Like Alex Swallow just said, I'm impressed people could hone it down. This is a really tough question when you've immersed yourself in the Coach's Journey podcast over a number of years. So interestingly, Chris Joseph was on there. Katie Harvey, episode 1 especially, was really meaningful for me, especially seeing as she was about to become my supervisor at that point. And actually, Henrietta's. I loved that audacious ask just to do it. So for those of you listening who may not have come across hers, and I really only was just thinking about it because everyone's chosen all mine already, but she did this thing. She was part of the community on that very first call, I remember, and came in and out for a while, and then to come and remind us all so beautifully of the 3 principles, and again to bring her own kind of flavor of integrity. And how many times have we said on this episode today, integrity, authenticity, truthful, honest? You know, she brought her own flavor of that, but she was one of us, and it was magic to listen to. I remember it was on a long car journey up north, and it was really lovely to hear. It was a parasocial, Neil. It was real. I really know her from our community, and there she was on the Coach's Journey podcast, giving her story and the way she's built her practice and the way she still is and the way she's always open to learning and the way she is. I found it really, again, encouraging, really encouraging.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful thing. Oh, sorry, Joe, I spoke over you then.
I was going to say, and I think Chris and Katie's are the same. There's real encouragement there because they're real, steady paced, you know, easy to understand, really articulate, really real, honest, raw, kind of any of us can do what they've done, what they're doing, what they still do.
Yeah, it's lovely. And Alex.
Yeah, let's just jump in there because I think we've all teased out these really amazing personal stories, but I think the thing that grounds it for me as well is all of the ones we've mentioned, and I also think of Matt Thielman's recently and Katria and Ahori's. There's some really interesting and insightful practical nuggets around how they run their coach business. I remember Matt Thielman had this beautiful question in enrollment calls, like, what are all the reasons that you will basically try and leave this coaching engagement? Let's get them on the table now. And I think Katria and Ahori had something like 4 tips at the end. And one of them I always tell other people who talk to me about coaching about, you know, just stay in coaching for X period of time. But it was really because I think you forget when you hear these stories of, oh, wow, they've had these amazing journeys, but actually there are these really specific steps that they've taken or learned as they've potentially tripped and fallen and picked themselves back up that actually we can kind of harness or utilize.
Yeah, and in a way, that's what I think. I think I knew some of this near the start. I don't know when I had this insight, but one of the things about really trying to get into the journeys that people have been on and what they've done, including the big picture thinking and the practical stuff, is when you listen to it, you get a choice. Like Joey says, we could do all this, and there's all there's practical insights, but which ones do we choose to do? Because no one's journey is exactly like Katie's or Chris's or Katrina's or any number of the other people we haven't mentioned, but they could be, they are a mixture of those with some uniqueness sprinkled in. So I'll just say a couple of my favorites that we haven't mentioned, or meaningful ones to me. The one with Barry Ennis is really meaningful to me because Barry died more recently, and so I know that is like a thing. You know, what a weird thing podcasting is, right? And it made me very aware when he died that I've made all this stuff that when my girls are grown up, probably will still be here, even when I'm not, and that you get this sense of like what that digital cloud storage means for the record keeping of the world. But also, I just, Barry was a lovely, lovely man. And so it's a great episode. And we had to stop because someone had their washing machine on. That's one of the things I remember about that one. And the other one from most recently, like I absolutely loved the conversation I had with Lindsay Lewis. She's I sent her a message the other day saying, that was earlier this year, saying, I think I have this thought often, Lindsay, which is that I resent that you live pretty much as far away from me as is possible, because if you lived nearby, I would be working really hard to make you my real friend. Because she's wonderful, like an amazing, amazing woman. And because in that episode, I think we get these two themes that have been, so we get these big spirit, almost spiritual like moments and viewpoints and ways of being that I can imagine will give somebody else the feeling that Ruth had on the side of the canal. And then she just nails these are the 4 skills you have to learn if you want to build a coaching business. Here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's very cool. So team, we're almost at time, for the listeners' sake. The thing we haven't talked about in great detail that we thought we might is, although I think it's come across in lots of ways, is why is this thing that we're doing together meaningful for each of you? I want to say like a couple of things about that for me before we finish, but and you don't all have to speak in this point, but I guess there's a part there which is like, why did you say yes to this, and why is it exciting or important for you to be a part of what's coming? Is there anybody who wants to speak to that at all? And again, it doesn't have to be. Ruth, and then Neil.
It actually goes back to Joel's podcast and that interview, because he talks about working with leaders and helping them navigate complexity and the world as it is now. And I think, and we quite often talk about it on group calls, that ripple effect. So I think it feels important for me because I'm going to be able to make more ripples. In the way that the podcast touched me, then, if I can do that with an interview for one person, then that's a ripple that's been created. So I think that sounds a bit airy-fairy, but I think you know what I mean.
It's one of those funny things, Ruth, that in a different conversation, it might sound airy-fairy, but because of for me, the themes of this conversation, it makes complete sense. And everyone else is shaking their heads. Let's assume all the listeners are too. No, it's not airy-fairy, Ruth.
Okay.
It's great.
Good.
Thank you. Neil, what was coming up for you?
I think there's a whole host of reasons. I'm not confident I'll do all of them justice just now. I believe in creating things and following my energy, and I've, without question, been hugely supported by the podcast thus far and the opportunity to contribute to the ongoing life of it and scratch my itch for creating things is really, really exciting. I think there are an extraordinary wealth of profoundly wonderful people operating in the coaching space, and I'd like to support the platforming of more of their voices. And I'm excited about the people that I'm going to get the opportunity to interview, and indeed that the other people on this call are going to interview, having seen some of the names and the sorts of people we're going to be talking to. And I think I very much resonate with Ruth's point that if I can connect more people to, like, I'm hugely lucky to be able to do that. And if I can connect more people to the stories and people that might spark something for them and set them off into the next phase, step, chapter of their journey, odyssey, development, in whatever way is right for them, in whatever part of the web or net they're currently at, then that feels like not only a great privilege, but also kind of a responsibility that I have the fortune to do that. It's both exciting and really rewarding and life affirming to have a place to be able to do that in a meaningful way.
Beautiful. Thanks, Neil. Joey, Alex, anything you want to put in at this moment before we bring the call to an end about why you're involved or anything else? No, beautiful. Okay, well, we'll hear lots more from them. If you want to get to know some of these people a little bit more, they have other podcasts. So between now and when I interview them, you can check out Neil or Ruth or Alex Swallow's podcast. Alex Whitton has some stuff on LinkedIn Live sometimes, so you can check out that. And we'll put links to people's websites and things. I don't think you have a podcast, do you, Joey? A secret podcast that I don't know about? No. We'll put links to that in the show notes. I'm really excited to be a listener. That's one of the things I just noticed when you were speaking, Neil, that one of the things that happens to me now is I get to become a listener to the show. And that's a very strange thing to think about. And I'm really looking forward to that. But just to close, one of the things that's really meaningful to me about this, so in having Gabriella, our second daughter, earlier this year, I found a lot of time when I'm kind of trapped, because she basically only sleeps when she's strapped to us. So there's some things I can't do. And one of the things I've been able to do is listen to podcasts. And like Neil said, we have a strong affinity, he and I particularly have and Ruth as well, it sounds like, have a strong affinity for Tim Ferriss. I haven't listened to the Tim Ferriss show much for years, and I found myself listening to a lot. And a couple of things came together in it for me, which is pertinent to this. So one was this great question that Nassim Taleb asked in the interview that he did, was important for him. It's like, who do you envy? Is a great question to ask. And what do you envy about them? Because that told Taleb that he didn't want to be an investment banker or a hedge fund manager, which is what he was doing. He envied the academics, the people doing the research in the pure stuff. And that's what took him into the big pieces of work that he does. And I realized that I was really envying Tim Ferriss and his involvement with Shopify, because I'd listened to 2 interviews with 2 of the senior leaders at Shopify. I was trying to get into what is that I envy. And there are a few things in there, but one of them is this beautiful thing that Toby Looker says in the interview that Tim did with him, which parasocial, there we go again, me calling him Tim. I try not to do that because it feels too parasocial, although I didn't know the meaning of parasocial before this conversation. Toby says this amazing thing. There we go. It's impossible not to do it. Toby Looker says this amazing thing. He says, one of the things that makes the most one of the things that is most meaningful in life is to go on a journey doing hard things with friends. And I realized that was one of the things I was really envious. And I always like it when I misquote stuff. So I've been saying, ever since I heard that, I've been just, Toby Looker might say this as well. I've been saying, what a privilege it is to get to go on adventures with friends, which is my way of saying, I think the same thing. So I'm very grateful that the 5 of you are all here with me on this adventure. We'll see what happens. I'm very grateful that all the listeners are here. For those of you that have made it to the end of 2 and a bit hours, especially grateful to you. And we'll be back in the new year with 2 episodes a month, maybe more some of the time. We'll have interviews with these 5. We've got some amazing other guests. But between now and then, have a wonderful Christmas and a happy and exciting start to 2024.